Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Friday program. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are honored to welcome Thom Hartmann, the quintessential progressive talk show host and New York Times best-selling author. Thom's daily 3-hour program is syndicated worldwide, and I know many of you watch it or listen to it, and reaches over 1 billion homes. He is also a brilliant historian who specializes in American history, and his 10-book Hidden History series is what we're going to be talking about today, actually the latest book in that series. And the whole series is really an excellent roadmap to understanding American history, especially the history we didn't get in school or things that have happened since we were in school. So today we're focusing on the latest book in the 10-book series. This is The Hidden History of the American Dream, the Demise of the Middle Class, and How to Rescue Our Future. So welcome, Thom. It's great to have you here.
Well, thanks, George. It's great to be here. I appreciate your inviting me.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a long history, which we won't go into right now, but Thom spoke at our conference in Dubrovnik in 2007 and broadcast his radio show from there. It was really a wonderful time. So I want to ask, the first question is about the middle class that you wrote about in your book. And you said that it must be created and how to be created, but it requires government intervention in the marketplace.
Yeah.
However, in the past 40 years, as you know, most government intervention in the marketplace has been to aid corporations, banks, and fossil fuel companies with tax breaks, bailouts, and subsidies. So how can government be turned around to aid the people? What needs to happen to make a shift from corporate friendly to people friendly?
This is a conversation that Americans have been having since the founding of our republic. Back in the Revolutionary era, Adam Smith is most well known for his book Wealth of Nations, but his book Theory of Moral Sentiments actually lays this out, although Wealth of Nations references it, that if you have a capitalist system without significant government intervention, it's always going to produce one basic result, which is the world that Charles Dickens wrote about. In Charles Dickens' writings, if you think of, for example, The Christmas Carol, um, you have the top 1% who control about 90% of all the wealth. That's the royal family and their buddies. Then you've got a very small middle class, 3 to 5%, which was Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge was the middle class. And that the middle class is made up of doctors and lawyers and shop owners. And Scrooge had, this little one employee company, the definition of a small business. And then, of course, the bottom 95% of the just terribly poor, the working poor. That was Bob Cratchit. And so what Smith said was that there were a variety of ways that government could intervene in ways that would tend to increase the probability of wealth among the working people and could put limits on severe wealth. We didn't much do that for a long, long time in the United States. There was the progressive era from 1880 to 1915, arguably, when we got the income tax, we got the estate tax, we started enforcing, we got the Sherman Act in 1891, 1890, we started enforcing it in 1905. So that was the first effort, but it was really FDR in 1933 who said, and at that point in time, when FDR came into office, only 15% of us were in the middle class. And no country had ever gone beyond about 50% of its population being in the middle class. And FDR said, we're going to create a big middle class. And he set out to do it, with the unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, the right to unionize, very, very high taxes on the morbidly rich and on corporations that encouraged corporations to reinvest in their people and in R&D, and that encouraged billionaires not to take money out of their companies. And it worked. From 1933 until 1981, we reached the point in 1981 when Reagan came into office that about 2/3 of us were in the middle class, which was an amazing thing. And but there was this problem, and that was that Republicans thought this was a really bad thing. In part, that goes back to 1951 when Russell Kirk published his book, The Conservative Mind, From Burke to Eliot. And in that book, and a lot of the writings around that book, actually, from William F. Buckley and others, They were basically arguing that if the middle class ever got too large, because middle class people are not born to great wealth, they haven't come out of political dynasties, they don't know how to govern a country, that if you gave too much political power and economic power to the working class people, they would screw up the country. And that basically three big things would come out of too big a middle class. Number one, young people would no longer respect their elders, which would create societal chaos. Number two, women would no longer know their place in the family and would, seek to abandon their families, which would create social chaos. And number three, that religious and in particular racial minorities would demand immediate equality with white people, which would produce social chaos. And when Kirk wrote that book in 51, he was largely considered a crank. Barry Goldwater got all excited about it, as did Buckley, but even most Republicans didn't take it seriously until the 1960s. In 1961, we got the legalization of the birth control pill. The FDA approved that. So by 65, 66, you had a major women's movement saying, now that we can control our fertility, we want to be able to participate in the workplace on an equal basis. You had also around that same time in the mid 60s, you had young men saying, no, we're not going to go to Vietnam. And this was the decade of peak civil rights activity. And when Martin Luther King was assassinated, we had cities on fire across America. I looked at that, having been part of that in the 60s, as the logical, appropriate, healthy, positive transition, the next phase in America's evolution. Yes, we're bringing women, we're bringing minorities, and young people are having a voice. But Republicans looked at this and said, holy crap, Russell Kirk was right. This is going to be the end of America if this middle class gets any bigger. I mean, already it's 2/3 of us, and that's way too big, obviously, because look at this social chaos. So when Reagan came into office in 81, his mandate was to reduce the size of the American middle class to save the country. And he did. He went after unions. He lowered the top tax rate. He offshored our jobs with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, the World Trade Organization, and ultimately NAFTA, which was negotiated during the Reagan and Bush administrations, even though Clinton signed it. And the result of that was that roughly 50,000 factories and 15 million jobs left the United States between the 1980s and now. And the result of that is that only between 43 and 47% of us are now in the middle class, number one. Number two, it takes 2.3 incomes to sustain a lifestyle that you could sustain with one income in 1981. And number three, and I point these all out in the opening chapter of the book, when my generation was in our 30s, we controlled 21% of the nation's wealth. The generation right now in their 30s controls 4.6% of the nation's wealth. So Reaganism, 43 years of Reaganism has been very, very successful at gutting the American middle class. Contrary to Republicans' belief, it hasn't produced the social stability they thought it would. Women didn't just say, oh, well, we'll just go back to being housewives. Young people didn't say, oh, okay, we'll just go back to being students. And minorities didn't say, well, yeah, we'll wait another 50 or 100 years. And so Trump then comes along and the GOP and they say, hey, middle class, you've been gutted. You're only 43% of the population. It takes two income, quack, quack, quack. You know who did this to you? It's those brown people. It's those liberals. It's those black people. It's, and it's women scapegoating all of these groups. And it's created a fertile ground for the worst kind of demagoguery. And I'm sorry for the long answer there. I know you asked me what time it was, and I told you how to build a clock, but that's kind of the big picture setup for the whole book.
Right. And there's so many places I could go to from that. But what I want to go to, because I think it shows where the Democratic Party and people who were Democrats bought into this philosophy that you're talking about right now. And that was something you brought up in the book, and I was so happy you said this. You made a dismissive comment about Tom Friedman's what you call discredited book, which is The Nexus and the Olive Tree. But during that time, when Friedman wrote that book, a lot of Democrats were believing it, were buying into it. And this was, of course, talking about the transfer of jobs overseas. And it became the darling of the Democrats' thinking at that time. And Friedman always has this kind of know-it-all posturing that seems to get people, or used to, people to believe him. But to me, that was a point in a book that showed how the Democrats were starting to follow into that thinking. And you mentioned something about the Buy American Act. So I'd like you to, in reference to this, talk a little bit about that and how it could be changed to support American manufacturing or perhaps a new wave of American businesses and even maybe cooperative businesses. Is that too much rolled into one question?
Oh, that's great. That's great. Yeah, Tom Friedman, I mean, he's a very smart guy and he's written some pretty good books and he's sometimes a very astute observer. He also married a woman who's a billionaire, ever since then, it almost seems like he's convinced he can do no wrong, like billionaires are always right or something. But I don't know. I don't know the guy personally. I'm reluctant to knock him, but yeah, the book was BS. And that charge that he was leading is something that we generally refer to as neoliberalism, which was 2 books ago, a year
Right.
ago, my book, The Hidden History of Neoliberalism. And Bill Clinton bought into it, and Barack Obama bought into it. I mean, the first president since Jimmy Carter to say no to neoliberalism, and even Jimmy Carter was starting to say yes to it in the last year of his presidency when he deregulated the airlines and the railroad industry and the travel industry. But the first president to say no to neoliberalism has been President Biden. He's bringing jobs back home. He's putting tariffs on things to bring jobs back home. And I realize that in this age of Donald Trump, you're not supposed to say that, but it's true. And so, it's a good thing. The Buy America Act was a law that was passed, I believe, in 1935 at the request of Franklin Roosevelt. And what it said was that the federal government, which was a smaller part of the economy back then, but today is in the neighborhood of 1/5 of our entire economy is government spending. That the federal government, whenever it bought anything from desks to ammunition, had to buy it, had to source it from American manufacturers. There was a provision in the Buy America Act that during a time of crisis, declared by the president, the president could issue waivers. And so when Reagan came into office, this whole, Friedman, not Thomas, but Milton, neoliberalism thing that Thomas then picked up on later, was really, in the forefront. It was something Reagan was very, very committed to. And so he just started issuing waivers for the Buy America Act like they were jelly beans. And that sped up the process of, offshoring all of our manufacturing. So, and again, now you see, again, the first president since 1981, Joe Biden, is starting to respect the Buy America Act and is starting to demand that our military buy America. I mean, it's really ironic. We can't build a battleship without parts from China. And we may have to use those battleships to take on China, which is just bizarre.
Well, I hope it never comes to that. I do want to go into housing, but I thought it would be important to look at education also, because as you mentioned in the book, public schools are on the Republican hit list.
Yeah.
But an ignorant populace is much easier to manipulate and control. And as you noted, free education built the middle class. And you and I both lived at a time when university was free. And of course, this changed with Reagan. And Reagan said that college students were too liberal. And you quoted him on this, which is, I find, an appalling quote. He said, America, quote, should not subsidize intellectual curiosity, unquote. I'd like you to comment on that.
He called college students brats. And 4 days before Kent State, he said, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. Yeah. I make the argument in the book that, first of all, we need to, rather than eviscerating our public education system, and we now have 4 Republican-controlled states that have statewide voucher programs where people are, encouraging parents to send their kids to private schools and to church schools instead of public schools, and it's part of it is trying to kneecap the teachers' unions. This is the last bastion of unionization in the United States, or at least among government. And part of it is, they just, oh my God, these public schools are teaching actual science and they're not teaching religion. And they're, and as you say, Georgia, it's easier to manipulate people when they're ignorant. So number one, we need to Dwight Eisenhower was really the champion of this. I mean, I remember I was in second grade when Sputnik went up
Mhm.
and in 1957, and Eisenhower's response to that was to start accelerated learning programs. And I was lucky I was in one. So by the time I was out of sixth grade, I was doing like calculus. I was reading at a college level. I was, I had had a year of Latin and 2 years of Spanish. It was pretty amazing. But that all kind of came to a screeching halt with the Reagan presidency. In fact, Reagan in his first year cut federal spending on education by 17%. So so there's that, and frankly, I think we need to go back to, a good public education system. Number two, the college should be free. And in fact, we should subsidize college. And this is the big lesson that we learned that I lay out in the book from the World War II, from the GI Bill, which my dad went to school on and my wife's father went to school on. And the GI Bill, what we discovered was that for every $1 we invested sending these young people who had come back from World War II off to college, mostly young men, for every dollar we invested in them, we made an additional $7 in income tax revenue that we wouldn't have made had they not had a college education, because people with college educations make more money. My dad dropped out after 2 years because mom got pregnant with me and went to work in a tool and die shop. But Louise's dad stayed in all the way through his law degree and became the assistant attorney general for the state of Michigan. He was dirt poor. I mean, he came from a dirt poor family. They didn't have hot water in their house.
Mhm.
So this is, it's just demonstrably to the benefit of a country. And this is why every other developed country in the world offers either free college education or subsidized college education. In Germany, in France, in Finland, in Denmark, in Costa Rica, in many of these countries, they will actually pay you to go to college. Just like my dad got a $200 a month stipend from the GI Bill to go to college back when he did. And we really need to consider going back to that too. In fact, I argue that our student debt crisis isn't just a crisis, it's a crime. It's a crime against our nation as well as a crime against our young people. But
Especially when you see that everyone in Europe can get a free college education. It's,
there's 300,000 American students going to school in Germany right now for free.
uh-huh. Yeah, there's lots of countries they can go to for free in Europe. I want to mention lastly, before I open it up to other people to ask questions, the housing crisis, which you talk about. And there are two different parts of that. Well, they're related though. You mentioned about foreign buyers and corporations that come in and buy up whole tracts or neighborhoods of housing. And then, of course, the prices go up, individual families can't outbid them, and how this is causing one level of crisis. Of course, the Airbnb is causing another level of crisis because rentals aren't available. And there's also domestic corporations like Blackstone that are buying up neighborhoods. In fact, you mentioned that they bought up $150 million worth of houses every week.
Yeah.
So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and then also the ratio between income and what people are paying for rent or for mortgages, because it's huge. I mean, the gap now, many people are paying 50% of their income on rent or housing. So if you could just speak on those two things before I open it
Sure.
up.
I remember when my dad got a job in a tool and die shop, and we suddenly got catapulted into the middle class. That was also when I was 7 years old in second grade, and he was able to buy a house. His first house. And back then, the cost of a house was a little less than 2.5 times the average annual wage. Dad was making around $7,000 a year. He bought a house for $13,000 in South Lansing, Michigan. That house is now worth about 100,000. My brother's daughter lives there, and that's the house I grew up in. Now, today, the average income in the United States is $40,000 a year, more or less, and the average house price is around $430,000. So now it's 10 to 1 instead of 2 to 1. And that has, that represents a real problem for people, young people in particular who want to buy their first house. Part of the problem is that we have no limits on foreign investment in real estate in the United States. Real estate is the last grand frontier for money laundering. It's how Donald Trump made most of his money. laundering money for criminal enterprises and foreign governments, particularly Russia, through real estate. So we've got roughly 15 million empty houses in the United States right now, and we've got about 1 million homeless people. Those ratios are really weird, but most of these empty homes are investment properties, and Chinese billionaires, European billionaires, Saudis. I mean, just it's real estate in the United States is a great place to park your money, and it appreciates over time. Number one. Number two, after the housing crisis crash in 2007, after the Bush crash, one of the big banks, I forget which one, published an article saying now is the time for investment funds, banks and hedge funds and whatnot to jump into housing because, you can make big bucks. And they really hadn't before that point in time. And this is, you'll notice, from 2010 to today, this is when the real explosion in housing prices started and rents. And so, these big companies, Blackstone, you mentioned, Georgia, is now the largest landlord in America. And, they'll go into a town and some just buy, like large percentages of all the homes. You see these ads, we'll buy your home for cash. These are the corporate home buyers. And what they do is they buy the houses and they turn them into rental properties. And then they use this software that's being sued right now by the Biden administration for monopoly practices to determine, what's the most that they can raise prices to. The other thing that it was a fascinating study published by Zillow 2 years ago that found that when housing costs exceed 34% of income, then for every 1 percentage point above 34%, you see a 1% increase in homelessness. It's almost a linear relationship beyond that 34%. And increasingly, neighborhoods around the United States, we're seeing the cost of housing, be 35%, 37%, 39%, in some cases much more than that, above median income. So I argue in the book, and I've argued for a long, long time, that housing is one of three things, arguably four things, housing, healthcare, education, and food, that should be considered part of the commons. That is, it's essential to life. You can't live if you don't have a roof over your house or over your head. At least you can't live decently. And therefore, we should put strict limits on foreign investment in the United States. Canada has done this. And we should put strict limits on corporate investment in real estate. And I would go so far as to say nobody, no corporation, no individual in the United States should be able to own more than, say, 5 houses. And then let's force a divestment. And that would, really open up the housing market in the United States.
It's a great idea, Thom, something we should work on. I want to just mention the book, which is The Hidden History of the American Dream. And all these hidden history books are short, but they're packed with so much information. There's no filler. This is what I love about your books, Thom. There's no filler in your books. It's all really important information to have. So I wanted to mention that. And one last thing, and then I'm opening it up. So if you want to ask a question, start putting your hand up in the automatic hand raising thing. Any comments on the upcoming election in 4 days?
I think it's going to be a blowout for Kamala Harris. I've been saying this for several months. I think the polls are missing the new female voters, and they're missing how pissed off women are. And in particular, they're missing Republican women who will not tell their husbands, much less a pollster, who they're going to vote for. I could be wrong. I was wrong in 2016. So I'm, and I certainly don't want to encourage anybody not to go vote because I think it's in the bag. I am very concerned that, there's about $6 billion that's been poured into this election by right-wing billionaires so far. And they are just exploding. I mean, they're running ads here in Oregon, attacking Democrats in ways that are just vicious. And I'm very concerned about the future, in particular the Senate. We're defending mostly Democrats are defending Senate seats right now. And if we lose the Senate, that's going to be real problematic. We really need to take both the House and Senate if we're going to get anything done.
Right, that's what I realized too. Okay, Fran Corton has her hand up. Fran, do you want to unmute?
Hey, Fran. Hey, David. Great to see you guys.
Good to see you, Thom.
I miss you both.
So,
I assume you followed the campaign of Dan Osborne in Nebraska
Yeah, somewhat.
a bit.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
So, I think the people on this call probably know he's running as an independent against a right-wing Republican
Right.
in Nebraska and seems to have a good chance.
Yep.
The polls vary, but maybe he's within one, or maybe he's one up or two down or whatever. But he's very close. Um, he his approach is to focus on what he calls the working man, people like himself,
Yep.
no college education, but union was head of the union at Kellogg, and not fiddle much with a lot of the uh, what I might call a little bit more marginal social issues. So he's
Mhm.
pro-life, but in terms of some of the transgender stuff and all that, he says, no, I'm not going there. And of course, he won't vote for an assault weapons ban.
Right.
So my question for you is, if he wins, does this look like a pattern to reclaim the working class?
I'm not sure that would be the case. That's a great question. I think it's more of a pattern about how to win an election in a red state without being a Republican, and that is that you can't be a Democrat.
Right.
Uh, and I think we probably saw the same thing in Maine with Angus King,
Mhm.
who's an independent also. And arguably even Bernie in Vermont. I mean, Vermont keeps electing Republican governors, but that's a whole nother story.
Mhm.
But and Jim Jeffords, used to be a Republican. When I lived in Vermont, he was our Republican senator. So, but I think that mostly it's, Dan is taking mostly Democratic positions, but he's being very careful to pick and choose the ones where there's broad support. And I think it's just real smart. It's real smart politics.
Mhm.
He's refusing to say that he's going to caucus with Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
I think that's a little disingenuous. You've got to caucus with somebody, and I can't believe that he's going to caucus with the Republicans, but we'll see. We'll see.
You don't have to caucus with anybody.
Well,
Uh,
you don't have to, but if you don't, you get rendered really ineffective really quickly.
Yeah, you get
Uh,
cut off.
yeah,
yeah,
if you're
but
not
what,
showing up for the meetings.
I was on a webinar with him, and what he said is, if he's the deciding vote for a whole ton of stuff,
Mhm.
they're going to put him on committees.
Yeah, yeah, but
So, yeah, anyway, thank you.
yeah, good
Okay,
point.
Katie has a question.
Hey, Katie.
Katie?
Yeah. Hi, Thom.
Hey.
Really, really pleased to meet you. Um, I'm a psychologist in a house that is, I can't downsize because I can't clear enough to buy something else in my anywhere practically. So I'm really grateful for all the topics you brought up. My question is psychologically, because I know you also have a background in psychology, what can encourage or empower the middle and lower classes to help make the changes that you're suggesting? And is the United Nation doing anything?
I don't know what the UN is up to these days with regard to that sort of issue. In terms of the middle and lower economic strata in America, the extraordinary trick that Reagan pulled off was causing working class people to identify with rich people.
Yeah.
There's the lottery syndrome. Maybe someday I'll be rich too, and I don't want to be taxed. And then there's oh yeah, we all love tax cuts, when in fact, when you cut taxes on working class people, what you do is drive down their wages, not up. David Ricardo's iron law of wages. But I think that this idea of class identification is one that really hasn't had much resonance in the American political
Interesting.
sphere since the 50s, really,
Yeah.
maybe the 60s. And I think it needs to come back. And Bernie's been trying to bring this back for a long,
Yeah.
long time. that there actually are classes, and the rich view themselves as a class apart. And there is class warfare going on in the United States, as Warren Buffett famously said. And he said, yes, there's class warfare and my class is winning. So I would argue that Democrats, and you're starting to hear this kind of rhetoric out of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which you never would have heard out of Barack Obama or Bill Clinton.
Right.
Democrats need to start emphasizing class consciousness, working class consciousness. And that's going to be the key to the whole thing. And this is what Franklin Roosevelt did when he talked about the economic royalists.
Yeah, right.
This is also what I think Biden really listened to Bernie, which some of the others did not, but he really took him seriously, and I applaud him for that.
Yeah, Biden and Bernie have been running a partnership here for the last couple of years. They're doing really well with it.
Yeah, a wonderful partnership.
Yeah.
So Julianne, you're next.
Hi, Julianne.
Julianne?
Yes, I just had to unmute. Yeah. Thank you, Georgia. Hi, Thom.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your incredible work. I listen to your radio program every week, and I follow you on Substack. You are so prolific.
Great.
Thank you for all of your insights. So thank you. So I have two questions. The first question is related to education, as you've explained, the attack on public education. And I am an educator. I have a background, many decades in doing education in different levels. And it's horrified me over the decades watching this attack on what is perhaps America's most amazing project over 100 years of creating education that could raise people's awareness. And so my first question to you is, what can we possibly do to move back to respect for public education? How can we possibly do this rather than it going just state by state, which, if the big Cheeto gets in office, then he'll throw it back to the states. So I wonder what your thoughts are on how we can possibly save and recreate and gain support. My second question is a more imminent one of this issue of Trump's supposed secret with the Speaker of the House about delaying or not delaying a count if all the counts have not come in from every state. And the trick, I've heard a couple of speakers talk about this on the radio in the last couple of days, the trick that apparently they'll pull in the House of Representatives. So anyway, please give us your wisdom.
I really believe that we need to be talking more about public education in a way that is not defensive. Up until this point, it's been that we're trying to hang on to what little we still have left, kind of thing, and fighting people like Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis. And instead, we should be talking about the importance of public education and talking about it in the context of the public good, of the commons, as it were, because it's arguably one of the most important parts of the commons. I'd like to hear a lot more of that from our politicians, particularly our Democratic politicians. We need to be fighting back rather than just playing defensive actions. With regard to Trump and Speaker Johnson's little secret, the consensus seems to be that they think that they will be able to get the Supreme Court to throw, based on multiple states, Republicans in multiple swing states claiming election irregularities, that they can then get the 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court to declare that the election is contested. And there's actually a word for it in the 12th Amendment. I'm sorry, I don't recall that word right now. And once that is established, and then probably Ginny Thomas is having conversations with Trump and Johnson about this all the time. Once that's established, then the election gets thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state has 1 vote. And that would mean that you'd have a 26-24 vote in favor of Donald Trump, and he would become president, which is, by the way, something that has happened before. It's how Jefferson became president. It's how, there's just, we did that for a long time. And it's still in the Constitution. I'm pretty sure that that's what they're talking about. The way to prevent that is to have a blowout election. If the election is even close, like it was in 2000, then it's possible for the Supreme Court to intervene and steal it from the Democrats, which is exactly what they did in 2000. We know that, we would have found an additional roughly 50,000 votes for Al Gore had the Florida Supreme Court mandated recount continued, which is why they had to stop it. So, but, we let them get away with it that time. I don't think Democrats are inclined to let Trump get away with this or the Supreme Court get away with this. I'm not sure exactly what we can do about it, but that certainly seems to be their game plan.
I think Kamala Harris is the strongest Democrat we've had in a long time.
Yeah.
I don't think she'll let them get by with anything that they shouldn't get by with. I'm going to go to Jonathan now, and this might be the last question, depending on how long it takes. So go ahead.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi,
Nice to see
how are you?
Yeah, great.
Good to see you.
Last time I saw you was in my backyard here.
That's right. Yeah, the pilgrimage.
Indeed.
It's a wonderful place back there. The first thing I just want to say is that I think Thomas Friedman is a dolt.
Yes, it's a fine word.
Okay.
Me too.
So unabjectly he is. The second thing, though, I think that what would really help us do much better in the future if we happen to win everything that we need to win is to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah.
And so Steve Silberstein is a local multimillionaire who has put a lot of money into that. And I really think that we need to do that.
Yeah, there's two strategies for that. The first, because it's in the Constitution, the first is to amend the Constitution. The problem with that is it requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states. There's been something like 29,000 proposed amendments to the Constitution, and we have like 29, I think. The second way is through this compact, this interstate compact that you can find at nationalpopularvote.com, and where each state that signs the compact agrees that they will designate all of their electoral votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. And that won't kick in. That doesn't take effect until states representing 270 electoral votes have signed on for it. And right now, we just added one other state in the last year or so. I think it was Michigan, maybe Jonathan. And I think we're around 230 electoral votes. And now we've reached the point where we're going to have to get some red states on board, which is going to require some major political realignments in those states. And, if we could just get Texas or Florida or both, or even Georgia, I mean, there's some possibilities there, North Carolina. The problem, of course, it's not going to happen in the next couple of 2, 3, 4 years, because it's going to require ungerrymandering these states and getting their legislatures under control, essentially. But I think probably within a decade, there's a very real possibility we can pull that thing off.
Maybe a bunch of us need to move to some of these states. So our last question will come from Randy.
Hey, Randy.
Hi, Thom. Thanks a lot. This has been really great. Could you comment on the role of media in advancing the neoliberal agenda over the last 40 years?
Well, media, most of the news media in the United States was very excited about neoliberalism. Particularly in the '80s. I mean, it was first proposed in the 1950s by Hayek and von Mises and Friedman, Milton, and it didn't really it was viewed as kind of a crackpot theory up until really the mid '70s. And then it started gaining some currency. And like I said, even Jimmy Carter bought into it in the last year of his presidency. Friedman was really good. Thomas Friedman was really good at using the media. Milton Friedman was really good at using the media. Mostly what you had was the media being manipulated by very, very wealthy individuals and large corporations who saw neoliberalism as the path to greater riches. And, I think that worm has turned, or tide has turned. I think that while most Americans don't know what the word neoliberalism even is or means, they know that they got screwed. And the sentiment that we should bring back the unions, we should bring back high tax rates for the morbidly rich, and we should bring back our jobs and engage in some level of protectionism. Those sentiments, I think, are very, very strong now. So, you know, if Kamala Harris becomes president and decides to, you know, put a bullseye on neoliberalism, I think that would be very successful for her politically, as well as the best thing that could happen to the country.
I'm going to
Thank
ask
you.
one last thing before we're going to let you go, and that is about the Citizens United.
Mm-hmm.
How can that be abolished?
Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution says that Congress shall establish regulations under which the Supreme Court must operate, and can also establish exceptions to things that the Supreme Court may rule on. And for the Patriot Act, for example, has a provision in it that says the Supreme Court cannot strike down this law. There's something like 100 laws right now on the books that have this is called court stripping, that have what are called court stripping provisions in them. And so all it would take is for Congress to pass a law saying that money is not speech, corporations are not persons. We are going to reimpose campaign finance limits and campaign spending limits and campaigning period limits, although that would be probably the hardest. And the Supreme Court may not rule on this. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to expand the court. The proposal that most people think is probably, you know, acceptable would add, you know, a couple of people every 2 years, I believe, one person every 2 years. That's probably going to be too slow to undo Citizens United. You know, another thing that would, with regard to the court, that would be a really good idea is to have a binding ethics code that would force Clarence Thomas and the other justices to recuse themselves from cases where their patrons have an interest, and that could take some of the wind out of their sails. But you know, whether that would help with Citizens United or not is problematic. But you know, it's important to remember, you know, Buckley, Bellotti. So I'm not sure about Buckley, but Bellotti, the 1978 decision that was written by Lewis Powell, it was a 5-4 decision. The Citizens United was a 5-4 decision. These were decisions that were 100% Republican, and you know, in their appointees and their decision, and that were narrowly decided, and around which there's enormous controversy. Citizens United and its predecessors, though, are the cancer within American democracy that we really need to address first off.
Well, hopefully we'll get Congress, and we know the work we have to do if we get majorities. So I want to thank you, Thom. I'm really holding right to the 45 minutes I promised. So I'm going to let you go, and thank you so much for doing this. And I will be in contact with you about our conference next year, and Louise also. So thank you so much, Thom.
Georgia, great to see everybody. Thank you so much. Good night. I'll bail out here and let you guys finish.
Okay.